116, He Leadeth Me. We'll sing the first, second, and fourth verses of that, and then Paul will teach us out here in the auditorium class. He leadeth me, O blessed thought, O words with heavenly comfort fraught. Whatever I do, where'er I be, still 'tis God's hand that leadeth me. He leadeth me by His own hand, He leadeth me. His faithful follower I would be, for by His hand He leadeth me. Sometimes mid scenes of deepest gloom, sometimes where Eden's bowers bloom. By waters still or troubled seas, still 'tis His hand that leadeth me. He leadeth me by His own hand, He leadeth me. His faithful follower I would be, for by His hand He leadeth me. And when my task on earth is done, when by Thy grace of victories won, Eden's cold way I will not flee, since God through Jordan leadeth me. He leadeth me by His own hand, He leadeth me. His faithful follower I would be, for by His hand He leadeth me.
Well, welcome to our class this evening. Hope you picked up one of the lesson sheets out in the foyer. Just a reminder, they're out there, but they're also on our website under the members section under resources. You can always go and get back lessons or whatever. They're posted on there, all of these that we've done so far. Tonight we're on the Book of Esther. Now, let's just say we didn't have the Bible and we had the Book of Esther. I would probably reread it many times over because it is just full of excitement. It's just a great book to read. And a lot of people have issues with it because God is not mentioned, and yet you see the hand of God all throughout the book of Esther. You can't read that. You can't read Esther without seeing the providence of God. So it's just a great story. It's the second book that's named after a woman. We looked at the other one last week, Ruth, and now tonight the book of Esther. It's kind of interesting that whether it's in Hebrew or Greek or Latin, it's named basically Esther, just in those different languages. Esther in Hebrew, Esther in Greek, and then the book of Esther, Liber Esther, in Latin. So that's kind of unusual. I think it's the first one we've looked at that really has the same name all the way throughout. in all three languages, which is kind of interesting. Now, who wrote the Book of Esther? I'm here to tell you we don't know. Josephus wanted to include it in Scripture early on in the time after Christ. He thought Mordecai wrote it. Most people say, well, the only thing about Mordecai, he's praised quite a bit, and Mordecai wouldn't praise himself. I don't know. Again, I don't know who wrote it. What I do know is the time frame that the Book of Esther occurred. And that's kind of neat that we know pretty specific dates of when this story in Ruth occurred. As we've looked at before, it is one of the megaloth, one of the 5 scrolls that are read at various festivals, and the Book of Esther naturally would be read for the Feast of Purim. And we'll talk more about the Feast of Purim a little later. It occurs before the Passover. It occurs usually in the early months of our year, February or March. And these are scrolls that were read during these festivals. And we've looked at all of them except this one we'll look at next week. Ecclesiastes, and that'll take care of those 5 scrolls. And then next we will look, I believe, at Daniel, and then Ezra and Nehemiah. And what's neat about that to me is we're looking at Esther tonight, we'll look at Daniel, and we'll look at Ezra and Nehemiah, and they all are interconnected as far as time frame. They're connected, and so sometimes it's easier for me if things are taught close together. I can remember better, and so maybe we can remember some of these dates or this time frame and get it fixed a little better in our minds. Because I don't know about you, but I do have trouble remembering some of these things that go on. The theme, I just pulled these slides out of some presentation, but I thought they were pretty neat. The theme, God delivers his people through the actions of Esther and Mordecai, and Purim is established. The context, it narrates the story of the Jews' deliverance while in Persia, written by an anonymous author sometime after approximately 450 BC, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that date is. Well, let's just talk about it now. Talk about dates. Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes the First. I don't know, Xerxes is easier for me to pronounce than Ahasuerus. And boy, when you see the other name, it's in there. I wouldn't even try to pronounce it, his Persian name or whatever it is. But we do know that he became king in 486 BC. And Vashti, his wife, his beautiful wife, who disobeyed his orders, she was deposed 3 years later, 483 BC. I meant to chase this further down. Xerxes was fixated on Greece for a couple of years, 480 and 479 BC. They mentioned this one, 479 BC, where he tried to invade Greece and he was unsuccessful. But 478 BC, we know that's pretty close because we know the year that the king was reigning, so we kind of know these dates. 478 BC, and then Purim, 5 years later, is established in 473 BC. Now, there's some other very important, I think, dates to consider. The Persian Empire, this Persian Empire that's occurring during all of this, it really got started in 550 BC and by Cyrus the Great. And it went on to 330 BC, which is when Alexander the Great took over the world and replaced the Persian Empire as the world empire, the Greek Empire. And before the Persian Empire, we had the Babylonian Empire. Before the Babylonian Empire, we had the Assyrian Empire. So all these world powers go in line, but 550 to 330 BC for this first Persian Empire. And there's another name to it, but maybe we'll talk about it in just a minute. What else is important? Well, how did the Persians become the rulers over the Jews? Well, you remember in 539 BC, when Daniel was going to be made the third the third most powerful man in Babylon, the Babylonian Empire was captured or destroyed or whatever by the Persians, and that was in 539 BC. In 538 BC, the first exiles went back to Jerusalem under the leadership of Zerubbabel, and went back, and they were supposed to start rebuilding the temple, and they just kind of procrastinated and got discouraged. And so Haggai comes along. You remember old Haggai we talked about not too long ago, that we could date his speeches and his messages from God? 520 BC, he stirred up the people, and in 516 BC, the temple was rebuilt and completed, and so that's an important date. 516 BC, and then we look 30 years later, Xerxes the first becomes the king of the Persian Empire. So what else happens? Well, the temple rebuilt in 516 BC, and we come on down here to 458 BC. 458 BC. Ezra brings the second group of exiles back to the Promised Land. So that's an important date, 458 BC. So we know that this second return of the exiles is after this deal with Haman trying to wipe out the Jews and them being saved, and Purim established, and Esther becomes this great heroine for the Jews. So we have it in between the rebuilding of the temple and Ezra leading the second group back to the Promised Land. So that kind of adds a bunch of dates in. If you're sitting in your mind wondering where all these places are, well, Jerusalem's over here next to the Mediterranean Sea. Here's where the Assyrian Empire was. Here's where the Babylonian Empire was. Susa is where this takes place. Shushan or Susa was the capital city there, or where they had their summer palace. This is modern-day Iran. Many of you remember when you talked about Iran, sometimes they would just call it Persia. The Shah of Iran was sometimes called the Persian king. So we're talking about modern-day Iran, where Susa was, where this intriguing story with Esther takes place, and Mordecai. But it's also where Daniel was at one time. So he was there in Susa at one time when he talked. So kind of important. Brief outline, the rise of Esther and Mordecai. During all this first and second chapter, Vashti gets deposed, Esther becomes queen, and Mordecai foils the plot to assassinate the king. And that becomes very important in this story. Haman Boy, he's a nasty guy. The Jews are threatened. They get the plot reversed, and that's just a great event. And then the Jews triumph there, and Mordecai becomes a very powerful man in the kingdom. So we come back to this timeline on the second page where we try to date the events, and I think we've talked about all that, but there's a little more detail in this about why we think it has to be. Xerxes was king from 486 to 465, 464, so about 8 or 9 years after Purim. But then he was replaced by Artaxerxes I, and we believe that the story of Ruth was probably recorded during his reign, during the reign of Artaxerxes I. So it would be after 465 BC, and I think earlier we said probably at 450 BC. I don't know. The point is, it was probably after Ahasuerus or Xerxes died. But then you can read all kinds of arguments that take it down to the period of the Maccabees. I'm not sure it should go that far. It seems that Purim was already being practiced, celebrated by the Jews before the Maccabean period, which indicates it was probably written before that this feast was already being celebrated. So anyway, that's why you see the date pushed at about 464 to 450 BC, somewhere in that range. What else do we want to add? Well, you can go back and read that material under the date that might help better explain it. Key text: who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time? Is there any other verse you remember from Esther as well as that one? Probably not. That's the one I think we think of when we think of Esther. That Esther, you probably became queen. You probably got to this position just so you could save your people. It's famous because it does not directly mention God. Again, you can't read it without seeing the providence of God. And then the one-sentence summary. Mordecai, if I got my understanding of Esther, was Mordecai's uncle's daughter, which in my southern roots, they were first cousins. I think that's the way it boils down, but it's never referred to that we always think of Mordecai being this older man and her this a lot younger woman, and probably true, but they're probably cousins, so that's helpful to know. Purim. Pur, P-U-R in Hebrew, means a lot. They cast lots, if you remember. You can look up the verses, and that's how they determined some things in this story of Ruth. But up here, Purim, they have it showing that it'd be in March. Some will move it on down to February. It's like Easter. It comes in. Is it always in April? What other months did it fall in? March. So, it could slip over here to March. Well, Purim's the same. It's in February, March, but it could be in February. I just thought that was a neat slide that showed all the different feasts for the Jewish people. Now we get to geography. I love geography. I was glad I got to print you a color map. I meant to give you one last week and I messed up. let me get over here. There is Susa, or Sushan, which is just north of the Persian Gulf and in what was Persia. Here we have Nineveh and Babylon between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But Persia at this time, and the book of Esther tells us that, goes all the way from India, all the way south of Egypt to Ethiopia, I believe the country mentioned. So Persian Empire was huge, and but he couldn't expand to the west. He could not take Greece, and he got repelled in 480 and 479 BC. Just couldn't do it. But that's a whole nother story of history. But just look how big the Persian Empire was. It was huge, larger than the Babylonian Empire. So it was very, 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 very big. Any comments, questions up to this point? I know I throw a bunch of stuff out at you.
One thing that I never zeroed in on is how long it was between the time that Vashti was dethroned to Esther. It was about, according to your dates up there, about 5 years.
Yeah, it took a while. I can't even remember what the exact dates were. Was it
483 BC to
479? Yeah, 4 years. No, I mean, yeah, 5 years.
I'm reading it, it's just like, okay, yesterday she was deposed and tomorrow was...
For the people who couldn't hear Marie's comment, was she had never realized the period of time between the time Vashti was deposed to the time that Esther became queen, which figures out, according to this, 5 years. However, as you read through the book of Esther, you don't see that big time gap. But I guess it took some time to also prepare all those women. That was a lengthy process, and so, and I don't know how many women were involved. I can't remember if it doesn't tell that, but how many women were involved in this selection process. But that would have been extensive. So, good point. Good point. I want to read the first 4 verses. Because as you read the first 4 verses, the map becomes more important. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. So that's helpful to see it on a map. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, or Susa, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. That was a long celebration. Now, I don't know what all they did in that, because he throws a feast after this that lasts for 7 days. So I don't know what all was involved. It might like, remember when we had most of y'all were around, 1976, when we had the bicentennial. Remember there were events scattered out through the year. Well, I think that's kind of what we're looking at here, that they believe that this was a great celebration. Xerxes has taken power. They are the world empire now, and he has had a lot of success, and so he's thrown this big celebration display all the power and might of the Persian Empire for 180 days. Kind of a good place to start. Down at the bottom of page 3, the value of Esther. It shows the importance of the Jewish people to the plan of God when the narrative tells how the Jews, through God's providence, escaped annihilation on this one occasion. It implies that they as a people had a significant role to play in God's plan of redemption. God had promised to save the world through the seed of Abraham. That promise continued through the nation of Israel. If God had allowed Israel to be exterminated, he would have been surrendering his purpose to defeat. The book certainly emphasizes the Jewishness of God's people. The word Jew in its singular or plural form is found over 50 times in the 10 chapters of Esther, far more than it is found in all the rest of the Old Testament books combined. Again, that's kind of one of those things that stands out. When you usually read the book of Esther, what do you think? I mean, do you think of this beautiful woman who was a heroine? Do you think of Mordecai? Do you think of all the intrigue? Do you think about, wow, the Jewish people were about to get whacked? I mean, really, totally destroyed. What do you really think when you think about the book of Esther?
Don't you see the providence of God?
Okay, I think you have to see the providence of God. But do we think of it as Jewishness? I'm not sure our thoughts encompass all the great things that are really involved in this book. But there's so many. Here.
It also shows that God keeps his promise because he's made the Jews the vessel through which Christ would come, and no one's going to stop that,
Okay.
not even the mighty Persian Empire.
Okay. God set forth a plan of redemption that involved his people that he had chosen, Israel, and this is another story that shows his plans are not going to be thwarted by anybody, not even the Persian Empire, as strong as they were. Good point. In Ruth, we saw how the seed of Abraham continued down through the lineage of Rahab the harlot, Ruth the Moabitess, and she was the great-grandmother of David. Beautiful story, but here it's kind of this thread that's maybe we read the story like almost like a novel, but that thread of redemption is there, and I think it's easy to lose sight of it. But Stan, you brought it back that's really one of the main things we see in this is God's plan is not going to be thwarted at all. Here's a more detailed outline. There are hundreds of outlines. I like this one because it kind of just goes chapter by chapter and all the interesting things that occur. I kind of like that one. Esther. Esther has been, I think it was early on accepted into the Jewish canon. Now, there's been a lot of debate over it, but I think Purim was celebrated very early, started with Esther, so we know it started, 473 BC, and so I think it was faithfully practiced through periods of time we don't have a record of, even up through the first century when Christ came along. However, there's been a lot of arguments against it being a part of the Jewish canon. I don't think they're valid, but that's another that's a whole nother study. But the Septuagint added a bunch of stuff, and it became apocryphal as a part of the Apocrypha, additions to Esther. Because God was not mentioned, somebody went in there and added 100 and something verses to bring God into the picture, and that's called the additions to Esther. There is no question, it was never part of the Hebrew text. It was never part of what we call the Masoretic text. Never part of that. It was just only in the Septuagint, in the Apocrypha, and not worth a whole lot. But I'll give you some of those statements in here. But I wanted to read the top of page 5. The great Jewish scholar Maimonides ranked Esther after the Pentateuch, declaring, when all the rest of the Old Testament passed away in the days of the coming of the Messiah, only Esther and the law would remain. Wow. That is a strong statement by a Jewish scholar. Now, notice the date, 1135 to 1204 AD. Now, on the other hand, Martin Luther. Martin Luther did some good stuff, but he also was messed up in some other things. And he wrote, I am so hostile to Second Maccabees, well, he should be to Second Maccabees, and to Esther, that I could wish they did not exist at all, for they Judaize too greatly and have much pagan impropriety. So Martin Luther hated the book of Esther. Now, I'm going to tell you something. I don't see how he could have come to that conclusion at that point. It was accepted as Jewish scripture. There was no question amongst the Jews that the book of Esther was part of scripture. Not the apocryphal part. I'm just talking about the basic text that we have of Esther. It was accepted, and yet Martin Luther said, I don't like it. So, and I guess that happens today. If we don't like it, we just toss it out. And sometimes we listen to people who make crazy statements like that, and we shouldn't. So anyway, you can put that wherever you want to put it, and we'll go on. I put you an archaeological note there. But one of the most interesting things I found when I started studying this, where some people see the book of Esther as comedy. And that just jumped off the page at me. This was in a Jewish commentary. And in the introductory part where they tell you all about the book and all, it said, Esther as comedy. I copied it for you, just like it's written there. Now, they wrote that because in some ways they didn't believe it was really a true story, that it's just storytelling. But is the book of Esther funny? Well, that's the favorite verse, but is it funny? There are some funny parts in Esther. Now just think about it. You remember when old Haman was asked by the king, what can we do to honor a man? Oh, yeah, Haman thought it was going to be him. And he said, well, you put him on the king's horse and put a robe on him and everybody has to bow down. Turns out it was for Mordecai, not for Haman. You have to smile when you read that. And then when Haman builds a gallows to hang Mordecai, and he ends up getting hanged on his own gallows, there's something funny about that. It's irony, but you almost have to laugh at old Haman. He got what he deserved. And then when he went and he realized that Esther was going to have him killed, and he's pleading for his life while her husband's out walking in the garden trying to cool off. And he falls on top of Esther, and the husband comes in, and they don't even let him say a word. They just haul him off to the gallows. I'm sorry, folks, but those are funny things, and you have to laugh at them. But is it really written as comedy? No. It's just something funny that happened in the story, irony, and it's okay to laugh at it. Thank you for your attention. I guess we better stop. Thank you.
Just a few